Everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the civil rights era, and we're actually going to take a couple of days of class. So this is the first presentation, and we're going to start with the issues that are really going to transform the 1950s and 1960s in the United States. The pictures on my screen, some of them might look familiar to you. If they don't, certainly by the time we're done with this presentation, I think you'll have a much better sense of the people and the issues at stake, starting in the 1950s, and how they will transform and continue to be a big part of social justice work in the United States today. So just to take you back a little bit in time, and again, we're always talking about building contextualization. It's important to understand that civil rights was going on in the period of Reconstruction. But following Reconstruction, after 1877, that Hayes-Tilden Compromise, we are going to see something akin to what had existed before. Ultimately, having skin that was not white relegated you to a different caste in American life. And although there are going to be wonderful institutions that are going to be created in the midst of these limitations, Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, certainly we are also going to see that the idea of separate but equal, which was certainly what the white South wanted in the wake of Civil War, definitely is becoming normalized after 1877. And ultimately, by 1896, it is the law of the land. It's not just in the American South, but everywhere. And unfortunately, it didn't apply just only to African Americans, but we'll see out west with Mexican Americans and Asian Americans having to live under a separate but equal structure. But even in the American North, you're going to see a lot of cities where there was absolutely no integration of schooling at that time, and won't be until the 1960s. So we are in a period where we're going to see groups like W.E.B. Du Bois's NAACP attempting to lead the charge. Ultimately, if you remember, it is a reaction to what was Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech. He articulated this idea that for African Americans, perhaps white racial accommodation would be the best choice, that they could maybe make economic gains, but the bargain they would make is that white prejudice was such impactful that it would ultimately not be countered socially or politically, as long as African Americans could continue to, within their own separate institutions, be educated and find work. And that was something that Du Bois could not agree with. He believed that you had to have all three. In fact, you probably wouldn't get social and economic equality until you got political equality. So he had a very different vision. And then we add that to the migration of people out of the American South that begins around 1910, 1915. We're going to see that other people like A. Philip Randolph's Congress of Racial Equality Corps, that comes out of the movement during World War II to see equal pay for African Americans in war industries, certainly the desegregation of the military by Truman in 1948. So we're moving towards something new. By the time we get to the 1950s, the Brown decision doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are going to be people challenging what had existed before. And, you can see Washington, he had a view based on his own experience. He had been born a slave. He did not believe his institution, where it was in the deep South in Alabama, that he was ever going to realize for himself or his people, at least in the immediate future, true equality. And so his own institution of higher learning, his goal to help African Americans be successful, independent of white progress. And certainly Du Bois is going to counter that. He was educated and born a free man in the North. He attended Harvard University, was one of the first African Americans to earn a PhD in this country, was one of the earliest sociologists. In fact, he's going to have an incredibly different view, that he believes that the goalpost has to be true parity with whites, and that African Americans can't be relegated to this caste in which they have been placed. And so he's going to work with his organization to legally break apart what has been the legal standing of the day, ultimately challenging notions like separate but equal, but also looking at other ways in which African Americans are negatively impacted by the law. Um, Primarily things like lynching, lack of proper representation in a court of law, and certainly a lack of voting rights. So, all of these things are going to lead us to a time where, but by the 1930s and 40s, we have African Americans who have migrated in large numbers, nearly 500,000 people by the end of World War II, and are going to be looking for more out of American life. And so that great migration is important because, one, it shows people who had once lived in the South under very draconian conditions that there were places where African Americans and whites might also use the public transportation together. They might, engage in terms of conversation, walking down the street. It's certainly, you didn't find many African Americans working in what were seen as white professions. But the door is open, and people are now saying, why can't I have more? And by the 1950s, we're going to see some pretty strong changes and passions igniting a new movement. And probably the event that ultimately is going to set this all in motion is what would have probably been a very minor court decision, probably would not have made news, except for groups of people who found out about this case and decided that this was going to be something that was so egregious it was going to have to be addressed. And that was the trial of the Scottsboro boys. So these 9 young African American men were all essentially homeless teenagers traveling the rails during the beginnings of the Great Depression. And in 1931, they were charged with raping these 2 white women in Alabama. There was never any forensic evidence that these women had been raped. It was merely their word. Actually, they were going to be charged with prostitution because they'd all been found stowing away on a train. And these 2 young women, in fact, had shown that they had a lot of cash in their pocket. They also had forensic evidence that they had been engaged recently in sexual behavior. They didn't want to take a charge for prostitution, and so they tried to cast themselves as victims of rape. And within days, these young men found themselves convicted. They had no attorney at the time, and some of them had even been convicted and given the death penalty. Groups like the American Communist Party, the ACLU, will offer aid to help these young men on appeal find some kind of redress. And as the case went through the courts in terms of appellate courts, in some cases there were retrials. And even when the young men were found guilty again, which many of them were, it also led to their legal counsel attempting to use the Supreme Court to intervene. And there actually will be a set of cases. Powell v. Alabama, which will be the first case in the country that says that someone who is facing a capital charge, meaning that if convicted, they could be put to death by the state, is entitled to legal counsel. Prior to that decision, you could be facing the death penalty, but because you could not afford legal counsel, it would not be given to you. And you were facing the almighty power of the state with little legal recourse. 3 years after that, what was called Norris v. Alabama was decided. And the Supreme Court said the fact that these young men were convicted by a jury of all white men and that no person of color could actually be a member of a jury in that county in Alabama because they couldn't actually register to vote, which is part and parcel to doing jury duty. And so we're seeing the Supreme Court, just through this miscarriage of justice, begin to examine how the law is utilized and how much advantage the state has, and certainly how little power African Americans have. So when we look at reinterpreting the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, especially in terms of due process and equal protection under the law, the misfortune of these 9 young men will ultimately be paving the way for what will become the Brown decision and other legal decisions that seek to create greater integration between black and white in American life. So the Brown decision of 1954 was based on multiple cases of young children who were being denied access to a local school because of the color of their skin. It's all referred to Brown v. Board of Education, but it's actually two separate cases. There's Brown 1 and Brown 2, and the Board of Education is actually Topeka, Kansas. And the court deliberately took this case and the set of cases that go with it because these were African American children being denied access to schools, not in the American South, but elsewhere. So, for many people, they might not have even reflected upon the fact that they were living in a place with a segregated school system. So, the challenge was, is separate but equal a realistic interpretation of the 14th Amendment? By creating the separateness, can we still have equality? And the court decided 9-0, which is significant. There was no justice that could not agree that the current state of separate but equal, the policies of that came out of Plessy v. Ferguson, were absolutely unconstitutional. That they violated the spirit of what is equal protection under the law as specified in the 14th Amendment. This only applied to schools, but it's the beginning. And also, the other important thing about the Brown decision is that the court said that these things needed to change with all deliberate speed. And that becomes the next issue. What does all deliberate speed look like? To the court, that meant immediately. We will see states that will continue to drag their feet on these changes. And in some cases, you won't really see true integration until the early 1970s. Education is one facet where we're seeing people seek greater integration. We're also going to see that there's all kinds of other injustices. We often speak about democracy and think about it only in terms of voting, but it's important to consider democracy in terms of human liberty, in terms of the ability to civilly participate. If you are restricted from using certain services by virtue of the color of your skin, how can that be a democratic society? And much like the Scottsboro Boys' case, all creating a sense of, at least in terms of the American legal system, an understanding that there was great injustice. We're going to see another event with another young African American man that will also help America, and in particular, one individual decide that they had had enough about the lack of civil justice that existed in the United States, and certainly in the American South in 1955. And that was the lynching of a young man named Emmett Till. Emmett Till had come from a family that was living in Chicago, but his own mother and father had migrated out of the South before he was even born. And so, although he'd been raised in Chicago, he had a little experience on and off in his childhood of returning to where his family originally came from in Mississippi. And when he was 16, his mother decided the best thing for him was to spend a summer being on the farm with his great uncle, his cousins, and understanding the kind of labor that his people had come from just for a short time. And so before school began in September of that year, he went to visit his family. And while he was traveling about, one day he and his cousins went to this corner store, and he came out and said he'd been asked to leave because he had made a comment to a white woman who was shopping in the store. And his cousin said, "You can't talk to a white woman. You certainly can't say what he claimed he had said, which was, 'Hey, baby.'" But this young woman, who was only in her early 20s, went home to her husband and said that a young black man had whistled at her and shown her disrespect and had made sexual comments to her. And in the middle of the night, Emmett Till was taken by gunpoint from his uncle's house, and he was never to be seen again alive. And when he was found several days later, he had been lynched. He'd been tied to an old cotton gin and thrown in a river. And two men were indicted in his murder. Both were white. Both were related to this young woman who had made claims of sexual overtures made to her that were unwanted. It was her husband and her brother. And they faced trial. And it became a national trial, in part because Emmett Till's mother made sure there was an open casket, that people could see what these men had done to her child. But in an all white community, an all white jury, they were found innocent. And out of that, not only were they found innocent, but they were men who did not have a lot of money. And they took $500 each to go on national television. And they claimed that they actually had killed him, why they had killed Emmett Till, and that they felt justified. And they could not be tried again because they'd been acquitted. And out of that, this woman, that's Rosa Parks. She believed that that was a miscarriage of justice. We tend to think of her as just sort of an older woman who somehow found herself on a bus and ended up starting the civil rights movement. But in actual fact, she had two jobs. Her second job was working as a secretary part time for the NAACP, and she'd gone through some training about nonviolent protest and how to properly execute it. But in December of 1955, she was riding a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. As she did, she owned no car. And when she sat down that day, she was told to go and sit in the back of the bus. And I find that's a story that most kids have heard. But why she wouldn't move on that day, she later said was because of Emmett Till. That the fact that he could get no justice, that a system that she had lived under and had been oppressed by, ultimately she could take no more. And she found herself thrown off the bus and arrested because she would not move to the back of the bus, which was the municipal law of the time in Montgomery, Alabama. And in response to that, the NAACP said they were interested in starting some kind of protest or boycott of the bus company. And this young man, that's Dr. Martin Luther King, who was in his late 20s at the time, he left his church in Atlanta and said that he would come and he would help direct this boycott. And he said, this boycott's got to get national attention and it's got to be a true boycott. No person of color can get on this bus, can give a single bit of money to this bus company. And it lasted 381 days, and the bus company went bankrupt. And Montgomery, Alabama decided that they would no longer have this policy. It also happened that within the same week, the Supreme Court had heard a case not on the part of Rosa Parks, but other people who had also been forced to walk to the back of the bus and give up their seat. And the Supreme Court had said that for all municipal transportation, that there could no longer be separate but equal policies. It's important to note that when we talk about schooling being integrated, this is public school. When we talk about integration in terms of, in this case, bus transportation, this was municipal, it was within a state, and it was taxpayer funded. And so, just like schools, the Supreme Court could say it was undemocratic to ultimately tax people for a service they could not utilize. The success of this boycott led Dr. King to form something called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that we'll call the SCLC from here on out. But this ultimately will be the group that will help organize and lead dozens of boycotts and protests and marches for the next decade to come. And a political cartoon here, one that I think speaks volumes to the change that is coming by the late 50s, early 1960s, which is eventually we're going to see the United States government, first with the Supreme Court, eventually with the president, and finally with Congress. But America, in the form of this bald eagle, is going to make Jim Crow go away. That Jim Crow has stood at the top of the flagpole and had the power for way too long. Now things are going to change. And they all begin with the process of recognizing equal protection under the law. So it's important to understand that the 14th Amendment and what that means, that it is actually inherently unequal to separate people. That's what the court decided. Um, we will have lots of other cases that usually people don't learn about, but I think they're equally important because they demonstrate, although we may be trying to integrate schools, there may be other ways in which segregation can continue on. So, Shuttlesworth v. Birmingham Board of Education. Reverend Shuttlesworth was suing on behalf of his daughters, who, although they could read at an early age, showed all kinds of gifted and talented abilities. They were not allowed to be in certain programs because it was just deemed that they had a lack of academic ability. And he found that in schools in Birmingham, Alabama, what they were doing was saying that African American children had demerits for poor behavior or were not testing at a certain level and therefore were in larger classes, perhaps with teachers who were not accredited, or were just absolutely not allowed to attend certain schools because they did not show the right social behavior or academic ability. And the court ruled in Shuttlesworth's favor that you could no longer attempt to use these things as a way to create segregation. So these beautiful children on my screen, they are children who between 1957 and 1960 integrated their public schools. These children here are the Little Rock Nine. So these are the 9 young men and women who in 1957 were the first people of color to go to school in what had been an all-white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. This young girl, she is 6 years old. Her name is Ruby Bridges, and she will start first grade in Louisiana in 1960. These young people worked together. The NAACP deliberately made sure that they had support for one another because of the reaction that they were going to face by whites who were unhappy to see the schools integrated. Ruby Bridges, because she was so young when she integrated her all-white school, she had the U.S. Marshal's office. They walked her to school, they stayed in the building with her, and walked her home every day for her first year of schooling. But in reaction to what begins to be this integration of schools, we are going to see across the South beginning the process of what was called massive resistance. And that is ultimately Southern states saying that they are not going to integrate. Um, Congress will even go so far, over 100 members will sign what they called a manifesto refusing to enact any integration legislation. And the president at that time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, what's always been considered one of his great failings is that in the wake of the 54 Brown decision, he did not make any overtures or comments directly about this idea of integration at all deliberate speed. And unfortunately, that lack of action, in some cases, empowered Southerners to stand in the way of integration. In other cases, it was simply you had states that refused in any way legally to meet these mandates that had now been put upon them. Virginia is often spoken about in 1955, 56, they had the year of no school. They just decided that the white population decided they'd rather not attend school, and you had counties that closed schools instead of having to integrate. But this happened all over the country. Even in Charlotte, North Carolina, the first student of color will integrate Harding High School in 1957. Her name was Dorothy Counts. She won't last a week because of the violent treatment by her classmates. And protesters attempted to firebomb her father's car and threatened her life. So we see that in this period, the first people who really took on the burden of integration were very young. They were people your age. In some cases, Ruby, they were 6 years old. And time again, it is going to take some kind of strong federal response to make this integration happen. So with the Little Rock Nine in 1957, you have these children who are now going to go to this all white high school. And there were parents and students who waited outside the school and threw rocks and spit and screamed as these kids attempted to get to school each day. You had protesters from other southern states who didn't even live in Little Rock, Arkansas, coming to protest. And it got so bad that finally Dwight Eisenhower had to send in the 101st Airborne. And ultimately, they had to occupy the school because you had this white resistance that literally was trying every day to stop these 9 teenagers from going to school, and great violence for any other person who was attempting to support these young people in their quest for education. But you can see that by 1960, this is 6 years after the Brown decision, that you have some states where not a single person of color has been allowed to enter a school with a white population. Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, 6 years on. And so, what becomes a great amount of protest is just simply the fact that the court made its decision, and you have states ultimately not being willing to recognize it. The attitude almost was that the federal government made this decision, but these are the states, and the states run the schools, and they can do what they like. So, what Eisenhower does in 1957 with the 101st Airborne is really important, but it will take a lot more legislation for these stats to change. We're also going to see that there are going to be other ways in which this movement is going to take shape. So we have the parents and the children who are trying to integrate. We're also going to see college level kids who want to really begin to test the boundaries of separate but equal in what is the workplace, what is in a commercial space. Before 1964, it was legal to not allow people of color to use your business, to say that there were certain seats that were only available to white patrons. And this begins to be challenged in the public sphere with the Greensboro SitIns here in North Carolina in 1960. And the organization that takes on this protest was called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And ultimately, they were college level kids who were working in conjunction with CORE and also with SCLC. But as college age kids, they were attempting to challenge all over the South. We'll see similar protests happening in Nashville, and other cities, in order to bring national attention to the fact that at all kinds of businesses, including Woolworths. So this was at the Woolworths lunch counter in Greensboro. And Woolworths was what was called a five and dime, very similar to what Walmart is today, but on a much smaller scale. And most of them had restaurants. They had like little stands for getting burgers and shakes and snacks. And they would not in the South serve Black patrons. And so beginning with 4 young men from Carolina A&T in 1960, they began their sit-in. And each day they would go to occupy their seats, and other people of color, and in some cases, white college students and other supporters would come and line up to take their seats. These people were arrested every time they did this, day after day. But it brought national attention to Woolworths, which was one of the largest companies in the world. They had a pretty big global footprint. And you saw that in countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, France, that you had patrons who would not use their business because they were concerned about the mistreatment of people of color in the United States. So it will have a tremendous effect because Woolworths will have to throw up their hands and say that they will allow anyone to sit at their lunch counters, that it impacted their business so negatively. And it's very similar to what happened with the Montgomery bus boycotts, is that we're seeing that some of this protest and boycott, really what it does is it hurts people's bottom line. It hurts them in their pocket. And by financially impacting them, we see some change. The Congress of Racial Equality, which tended to be adults who wanted to be part of the civil rights movement. They're going to work with young people with SNCC, and they are going to develop a project in 1961 called the Freedom Rides. And the Freedom Riders were, again, young college people who, in the summers, would go and, with course help, they would buy bus tickets and they would travel out of the northern part of the United States where African Americans could travel and sit anywhere they wanted to on a bus and take those buses into southern segregated cities where those states still allowed African Americans to only sit at the back of the bus. And so what they ended up doing is creating, again, national attention to this problem that if I got on a Greyhound bus in New York and I took that bus to Georgia, somewhere around Maryland, if I was African American, I would have to go sit in the back because I was not legally allowed to sit elsewhere in those states. Many of the Freedom Riders took on great risk. Although there were none of them on a bus, at a bus station, one of their buses was bombed. Um, and so there was a lot of violence and negative reaction. But again, it was just to show the American public that there were all sorts of injustices on a daily basis that African Americans had to face. Starting in 1963, we're going to see campaigns in a couple of different southern cities. The Birmingham campaign, again, this is Birmingham, Alabama. This campaign became a series of marches and protests um, for two reasons. One, integration, but the other was the lack of ability for voter registration. And by 1963, we're going to see a March on Washington, which Dr. King, CORE, SCLC, SNCC will all work together to organize. And they will get nearly 1 million people to show up in Washington, D.C. in late August of 1963 for freedom and jobs. And a lot of people tend to forget that Dr. King was certainly interested in racial justice, but he was also interested in equality when it came to the workplace and the kinds of work that people could do. It was so successful and so peaceful that unfortunately white segregationists decided that they were going to commit an act of terror. And in Alabama and Birmingham, they bombed a street, a church, that ended up killing four little girls who were there getting ready for a church activity. And unfortunately, for the next 2 years, you just see an ever increasing amount of violence, especially for those who want to keep segregation alive. Often, local municipalities and states would use their police and state police to beat protesters. But there was a significant amount of violence, so much so that there was a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and across something called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You had protesters who met head on with the state police, and hundreds of protesters were beaten, and thousands ended up being arrested in what's often called Bloody Sunday because of just the number of people who were hurt. So the federal government is not really looking to get involved in enforcement in 1954. I don't know if there was just a hope that the Supreme Court would make a decision and that everybody could live with it. But it proved that that was not enough, that the federal government was really going to have to come and make sure that separate but equal was gone and that integration in all aspects of American life was going to have to be federally mandated. And the first act will actually come through Eisenhower's White House, in part because of what happened in Little Rock. And that will be the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And it's important because it establishes a commission on civil rights. And so now, if you believe that you're not being allowed to register to vote, or the burden for attempting to register to vote is egregious, or your child is not able to attend a school that they should be able to attend since the Brown decision. This was a commission that would do the investigation. And their findings over the next 3 to 4 years are really what's going to impact the writing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Both of these are ultimately going to take this principle that integration is the law of the land and integration is equality and therefore the proper interpretation of the 14th Amendment. The Civil Rights Act is going to say that all public facilities, employment, that all people are to be treated equal in those places, and you cannot be barred because of sex or ethnicity or race or the color of your skin. The Voting Rights Act will come a year later, and it will be essentially a working law. So Congress had been hoping to actually amend the Constitution to get rid of some of what were the most egregious issues when it came to voting rights. And in the process of trying to do that, what often happens is that while you're waiting for a constitutional change to come about, that ratification process is slow, you are also then building the law for enforcement. So the 24th Amendment is what prohibits poll taxes, and really any kind of payment that is used in order to deny voting rights. It also says that all people, all American citizens at the time, age 21 and over, have the right to vote in federal elections. The Voting Rights Act is going to say that this is true at all levels, so within a state and also federally. Also, that anywhere where literacy tests were being used to deny voting rights, that you could have people register with the federal government, and that would be the same as registering with their state. And so at least that would impact their ability to participate in elections to decide their senator, their congressman, or their president. Um, but we will see that over the next 2 years, states will start slowly but surely coming on board in terms of honoring these changes in American life. But there will be this movement throughout the early 60s for what people will refer to as states' rights. And that phrase, if it looks familiar, because it's what people were saying in the antebellum South. And ultimately, that was part of the rallying cry for the secessionists leading up to the Civil War. But probably the most famous advocate of states' rights in the early 1960s was a man named George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama. And he made a speech at the University of Alabama in 1963 when the federal government was trying to integrate as much of American life as possible. He wanted to make sure that the college in his state did not become integrated. And he said, "In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw a line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." And he did this because an African American student had gained admittance to the University of Alabama, and he physically used his body to stop the student from actually being able to go to class. And eventually, what this required again was the federal government to send troops and to actually enforce the integration of the University of Alabama. George Wallace became popular amongst the segregationists of the time that he was a third party candidate for president in 1968, and he got nearly 1 million votes and won a significant amount of electoral votes out of 3 southern states. So his views were not his alone. There were many people who supported his viewpoint. So Dr. King's movement, what begins with the Brown decision, integrating schools, making sure people can use the facilities and participate in public life in America, and then certainly making sure we honor voting rights. This is all a process that is taking, ultimately, by the time it's sort of completed, at least on paper, more than a decade. And as that's beginning to happen, we're still seeing, we have a Voting Rights Act in 1965, but we're still having trouble, over the next couple of years getting all the African Americans who want to register to vote in states like Alabama and Mississippi actually the ability to vote. And so part of the movement that was involved in things like CORE and SNCC is going to kind of move in a different direction. And the idea of Black nationalism, we talked about it when we looked at Marcus Garvey and his United Negro Improvement Association in the 1920s. We're going to see a continuation, a revitalization, if you will, of Black nationalism. And part of that is going to come through the Nation of Islam, which is a church in the United States. And the Nation of Islam, as a faith community, um, prides itself on focused on self improvement and self discipline, rejecting Christianity because Christianity was ultimately seen as tied to the white Protestant control during an era of slavery and post emancipation. And it will be a movement that begins in the 1930s, but will gain more and more adherents starting in the 1950s and 60s, especially in Chicago and New York. Malcolm X was part of this group, and he is going to speak about separatism. Much like Marcus Garvey did, in part because of the amount of segregation and hostility that African Americans faced on a daily basis. In 1964, and part of it may have been some of the legal changes, his own pilgrimage to Mecca. Um, Malcolm X will come back and begin to talk a little bit more about the idea of perhaps that racial unity is possible. He will be assassinated in 1965, and that's always been associated with the Nation of Islam, although not a particular person held responsible for his assassination. But the Black nationalism movement, what will become by 1968 the Black Power movement, is one that is going to be kind of challenging the idea that simply by changing the law, the Supreme Court interpreting the 14th Amendment differently, that's ultimately relying philosophically on the white power structure and for them to ensure the racial equality. And Black Power as a movement really looked towards this idea of African Americans taking control for themselves. Stokely Carmichael was an active member, one of the founding members of SNCC. He was also involved in CORE. He will have to leave that organization because of a difference of opinion by 1966, and will begin to speak about Black power and really focusing on poverty and the economic injustice that's seen particularly in the workforce and business. The Black Power movement, much like the Black Panther Party, are going to be challenging what are a lot of the federal and state laws that had existed for a very long time. So, some of the principles and things like redlining that we talked about the other day, they're going to really want to challenge ultimately all of the structure. We tend to call it now systemic racism, but they were looking at ways in which African Americans were going to be agents of their own change. The Black Panther Party is actually the Black Panther Party for Self Defense, and it was founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by two men, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And they often were depicted as, armed, aggressive people. And they certainly posed a pretty assertive image. You can see here the two of them in this image above. But they were advocating for the armed defense of African Americans against law enforcement. There were hundreds of charges against the Oakland police for brutality and unlawful arrest. And there didn't seem to be any legal action happening against the Oakland Police Department. When African Americans called the police to their neighborhoods for help, often those calls went unanswered or they were delayed. And so Newton and Seal were talking about this idea that African Americans needed to do their own policing. The Oakland, California Police Department didn't even have any African American officers in 1966. Also, most states, including California, had all kinds of limitations on gun ownership for African Americans at the time. So they were attempting to challenge what they saw was continued abuse and misuse of policing power and the power of the state primarily against African Americans. Their community will really function in two places. So Oakland, California, and Philadelphia will be where their two largest chapters are still to this day. They're also going to oppose Vietnam, which many of these other people did too. Stokely Carmichael, Dr. King, they all questioned what was going on in Vietnam, in part because so many of the men who were fighting in the war, especially in frontline troops, were African American. So the integration of the armed forces in 1948, in many ways, was a positive and certainly a precursor to the civil rights movement. But it also meant that African Americans now could be exploited militarily, and that was something they stood against. So when we look at civil rights after Brown, especially when we look at interpretation of the 14th Amendment and the ability to truly integrate American life, including schools, we have to look at a couple of different issues. And the first one is busing. So the idea that when you attend public school, not only are you attending public school, but if it is not within walking distance, your municipality has a responsibility to help transport you there. So busing is often an issue. And 15 years after Brown, only a third of all African American children in this country attended schools with whites, especially in the South. And part of the reason was because schools were your where you went to school was decided by your neighborhood. And again, because of things like redlining, but also de facto segregation as well, we see communities of color and communities that are white, and they were attending different schools. And so, only if the families of African American students asked to integrate and also then asked for the services of busing could they really truly integrate these schools? And so by 1971, there will be a case that actually directly impacts Charlotte Mecklenburg, and that will be the Swan v. CMS case. And it will say that every student in a municipality will be subject to busing. This decision will hold true in Charlotte until 2003. There's some other school systems, like the Wake County school system in Raleigh, that decision won't really come down until about 2015. But by now, nobody is forced to comply with the Swan decision. But for more than 30 years, especially in Southern communities, every child was bused to school because it was the only way to stop what was the deliberate manipulation of school assignment as a way for whites to prevent integration. Coming after Brown, and this is really more of an issue when it comes to college and postgraduate study, was an issue that we call affirmative action. So if you consider the children who would have been the beneficiaries of the Brown decision, these would have been children somewhere between probably age 6 and 15. But consider their parents, their grandparents. Consider people who would have been over the age of 18 prior to 1954. You had millions of people in the United States who did not have the benefit of quality education. And also, attending college is a costly thing. Um, Being able to actually get admittance into a college, also just in terms of hiring practices, it seemed like there was a law, but there wasn't really compliance. And so affirmative action became this idea that you needed to have hiring, enrollment, especially at colleges, that was designed to make up for past discrimination. That if you had 1,000 candidates And for instance, the African American population was 12% in the United States, that at least 12% of your student body needed to be African American. And you couldn't just simply say, we're going to just take everybody with the highest test scores and work our way backwards until we fill the number of seats we have available. So the Supreme Court has heard many cases about affirmative action over the years, especially when it comes to college education. And the two issues are one, what constitutes a disadvantaged group, or what is used in legal terms as a suspect class? African Americans certainly are a disadvantaged group. That is often used also for people who are of Latinx groups. It's not used currently for Asian Americans, although there have been lawsuits recently about this. Also, the concern was there a quota system? So were we simply taking people based on filling numbers? And was this then a discriminatory practice against whites and males who may not actively have discriminated against anybody themselves, but face some kind of restriction because they're white and because they're male? And in 1978, the Supreme Court took a case called Bakke v. University of California. And the court said at that time, you can't have a quota. You can't have a raw number that you're based on. But you could use race as a factor amongst others to consider placement in a college or university. So you didn't simply say, okay, here is the census data and break up based on race of the United States, and therefore the number of students who attend a school are based on those numbers. But could you say that an African American student who maybe had a very good scores in some classes, but maybe had a lower standardized test score, that they might gain admission to a university when you had a white student who maybe had lower grades in their classes, but a higher standardized test? That essentially the school could say, we want to create a diverse population, and so we have some freedom and latitude to do that, but it can't simply be based on a raw number. So as we close out today, I want to leave you with some words by Henry David Thoreau. He wrote these in 1848 in response to the Mexican American War. He believed it was an unjust war. He believed ultimately it was a war that would spread slavery. And so he decided he wasn't going to pay his state taxes. And if you don't pay your taxes, the government might come and get you. So he spent some time in prison. And much like Dr. King, who wrote quite a few very interesting and thought provoking pieces while in prison, Thoreau wrote, "But to speak practically and as a citizen, unlike those who call themselves no government men, I ask for not at once no government, but at once a better government. Let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step towards obtaining it." So ultimately, he was saying that it's not that he didn't believe in government, but he believed that you could have better government and that it was important to communicate. And whether it was his case not paying his taxes, or it might be through some kind of protest or demonstration or boycott, that it's essential in the United States as a citizen to be able to do that, to ultimately say, I'm not satisfied with the government I have now. And I'm willing to put forward through some action, non-violently, of course, but in order to facilitate a change to make better government. And that's really what I want you to leave with, is this idea that ultimately the civil rights movement was looking at what we pride ourselves on, which is being a democracy, having a written constitution. But did we truly treat all citizens equally? No, absolutely not. And so, what begins with the Brown decision in 1954 is the beginnings of movements that are attempting to create a more equal place. And we're going to continue on with this theme in our next class, looking at some other minority protests. that begins starting in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, but ultimately inspired by the successes that came from the African American freedom movement that began in the 1950s.